There are a few key items to remember when rebuilding gas shocks. Care should be observed while handling the inflation needle and pressure gauges. Maintain your equipment and keep it in good condition. If injury should occur, consult a physician immediately. Extreme cleanliness is of utmost importance during all disassembly and reassembly operations to prevent any dirt or foreign particles from getting into the shocks. Keep all parts in order as they are disassembled. Note the direction and position of all internal parts for reassembly. Shock rebuilding procedures can be found in the suspension chapter of any Polaris service manual. Have the proper eyewear to avoid risk of injury when working with any gas shocks. Nitrogen gas is under extreme pressure. Use caution when releasing nitrogen gas from shocks. And keep in mind, the rebuilding processes in this video are the recommended steps in rebuilding. When performing maintenance on Ride FX shocks, use the Gas Shock Recharging Kit, part number 220-0421. It contains the necessary valves, pressure gauge, and fittings to deflate and pressurize the shocks. With the shock removed from the vehicle, you are ready to start disassembly. First, remove the upper and lower sleeve and bushings from the shock mount eyelets. If the shock incorporates a spring, remove the spring and collateral retainers. Before unscrewing preload springs, measure and record the compressed length of the installed spring, if so equipped. It is also recommended to mark the position of the spring for reinstallation. After you have washed and dried the shock, secure the lower mount of the shock in a vise. The use of soft jaws is recommended to prevent marks and damage to the shock. It is important that the gas shock be retained in the vise by the lower mount. Any other method of securing the shock body during these procedures may deform the shock body cylinder. With the shock in the vise, remove the small button head screw from the pressure valve assembly. Using a slotted screwdriver, loosen the pressure valve assembly counterclockwise 2 full revolutions, allowing the gas pressure to fully escape past the pressure valve assembly O-ring. Have a rag over the pressure valve assembly while gas is escaping to shield any matter that may be in the gas chamber. Warning: nitrogen gas is under extreme pressure. Use caution when releasing nitrogen gas from the shock. Always wear protective eyewear to avoid risk of injury. To make sure that all the gas has been released, push down on the shock rod. If the shock rod travels up, you know that gas is still present in the shock. Once the gas is fully discharged, you can then remove the pressure valve assembly from the lower end mount. Make sure you account for and inspect the O-ring. Then, using an adjustable face spanner, part number PS45262, fully loosen and remove the cylinder head assembly. Then, pour the oil out of the shock body. Always discard old oil into an approved storage container and dispose appropriately. Never reuse shock oil during shock rebuilding. In the next step, you will need to use the IFP tool, which is part number PS45261. The IFP tool can be set to extract the IFP by making sure that the lower disc has the threaded portion exposed. Thread the tool into the IFP. With the extraction tool threaded into the IFP, pull straight upwards, removing the IFP from the shock body. Account for the wear band and O-ring, and then place the IFP on a clean towel. You should then clean the inside of the shock body and dry it out. The next step is to place the shock piston rod upper mount in the vise and begin piston valve removal and inspection. Make sure you arrange parts you remove in the sequence of disassembly. At this time, you'll want to inspect the following items: the piston rod for straightness, nicks, burrs, or corrosion. The cylinder head assembly must be clean. It should be replaced if needed. Check the inside of the shock body for scratches, burrs, or excessive wear. Check the IFP Teflon piston wear band for cuts, chipped or nicked edges, or excessive wear. Check the O-rings for nicks, cuts, or cracks. Inspect the cap and rod seals for nicks, cuts, or cracks. Inspect the valve discs for kinks or waves. And check the compression bumpers on snowmobile ski shocks only for chipping, cracking, or missing parts. Should any of these items be in question, replacement is recommended. To assemble the shock, first place the piston rod upper mount into the vise. Then reassemble the damper rod assembly in the reverse order of disassembly. Pay special attention to the order of the rebound and compression disc or shim stacks to make sure that they are in the same order as they were before disassembly. When installing the piston, note that there are a different number of flats on each side. The piston has to be installed with the greater amount of flats facing the lock nut. If this is not done correctly, shock performance will be greatly affected. With the damper rod assembly in place, torque the lock nut to 15 to 20 foot-pounds or 21 to 28 Newton-meters and set aside. Do not over-torque the lock nut. If excessive torque is applied, damage to the piston valves will occur. The next step is to secure the shock body by its lower mount in the vise using the soft jaws. Thread the positioning head onto the IFP locator tool. Make sure that the lower disc has the flat side facing the IFP. Then, adjust the valve indicator so that the measurement specification reads at the bottom of the indicator. Measurement specifications can be found in a Polaris repair manual. On the internal floating piston, apply a thin film of oil onto the floating wear band and O-ring, and then install the IFP into the top of the shock body, positioning it below the internal threads. Using the IFP tool as a handle, push the IFP down into the shock body until the value indicator knob comes in contact with the shock body. The piston should then be located correctly. When pushing the IFP down, be careful not to damage the IFP wear band and O-ring. Next, apply a light film of shock oil to the pressure valve port threads. Tighten the pressure valve assembly by hand with a slotted head screwdriver, and then torque to 100 to 110 inch-pounds. The next step is to fill the shock body with shock oil. Use Polaris shock oil, part number 2873716, and fill the shock to the bottom of the threads within the cylinder. After filling the shock body with oil, allow a couple of minutes for all the air bubbles to come to the top. With the cylinder head assembly pushed down against the piston, carefully insert the piston rod and assembly into the cylinder. Slightly oscillate the piston rod to allow the piston to enter the shock body. During installation, some shock oil will overflow. Wrap a shop cloth around the shock body to catch possible oil overflow. Next, slowly push the piston rod and assembly into the shock body until the cylinder head assembly bottoms on the shock body. Slight up and down movement may be required to allow all the air to pass through the piston assembly. Installing the piston rod and assembly too quickly may displace the IFP from its original position. If the damper is expected to perform as designed, this must not occur. Using a spanner wrench, tighten the cylinder head securely into the shock cylinder. The next step is to gas charge the shock through the pressure valve. The specified pressure can be found in a Polaris manual. The piston rod should be fully extended from the shock body once the shock has been pressurized. Once the shock is correctly charged with gas, Install the small button head screw in the pressure valve assembly and tighten it securely. Push down on the shock rod and check the travel of the shock rod for smooth travel or dead spots. Finally, reinstall the sleeve and bushings in the lower shock mount and install the shock on the vehicle. Before beginning disassembly of the Fox PPS shock with a welded dome, first remove the shock from the vehicle. Remove the upper and lower sleeve and bushings from the shock mount eyelets, and then wash and dry the shock body. When performing maintenance on Fox shocks, use the gas shock recharging kit, part number 2200421. It contains the necessary valves, pressure gauge, and fittings to deflate and pressurize the shocks. With the lower mount of the shock secured in the vise, begin by removing the cap on the Schrader valve located on the lower portion of the shock. Depress the Schrader valve and release the nitrogen pressure from the shock in a safe direction, away from others and yourself. Warning: nitrogen gas is under extreme pressure. Use a shop towel to cover the valve and point the valve away from yourself and others. Use caution when releasing nitrogen gas from a shock. Always wear protective eyewear to avoid risk of injury. After the pressure is released, remove the Schrader valve core. Then, using an open-end wrench, remove the cylinder head assembly and place it on a clean shop towel for later use. Then, pour the oil out of the shock body. Always discard old oil into an approved storage container and dispose appropriately. Never reuse shock oil during shock rebuilding. Now, you will need to extract the IFP out of the shock. To do this, turn the shock upside down on a folded shop towel and apply slight air pressure to the Schrader valve. Caution: when extracting the IFP, use only slight air pressure. If high air pressure is applied, you may damage the IFP. When using this method, always replace the IFP O-ring. The next step is to secure the lower mount of the shock in a vise. Using the shock bypass sleeve removal tool, part number PS44925. Insert the lipped portion of the removal tool into the bypass sleeve body. Once the removal tool has bottomed out, spread the remover and thread the lock bolt through and lock the removal tool. With a firm grip on the removal tool, pull straight up on the bypass sleeve and remove it from the shock body. Place the bypass sleeve on a clean shop towel. You should then place the shock piston rod upper mount in the vise and begin piston and valve removal. Make sure you arrange parts you remove in the sequence of disassembly. At this time, you'll want to inspect the following items: the piston rod for straightness, nicks, burrs, or corrosion. The cylinder head assembly must be clean. It should be replaced if needed. Inspect the IFP for corrosion or damage. Check the IFP Teflon piston wear band for cuts, chipped or nicked edges, or excessive wear. New piston rings are .050 inches or 1.3 millimeters thick and should be replaced if less than .047 inches or 1.2 millimeters. Check the O-rings for nicks, cuts, or cracks. Inspect the cap and rod seals for nicks, cuts, or cracks. And inspect the valve discs for kinks or waves. Should any of these items be in question, replacement is recommended. To assemble the shock, first place the piston rod upper mount into the vise. Then reassemble the valve piston assembly in the reverse order of disassembly. Pay special attention to the order of the rebound and compression disc or shim stacks to make sure that they are in the same order as they were before disassembly. And make sure the piston is installed with the greater number of flats facing the lock nut end of the shaft. With the damper rod assembly in place, you should replace the lock nut and torque the new lock nut to 15 to 20 foot-pounds, or 21 to 28 newton-meters. Do not over-torque the lock nut. If excessive torque is applied, damage to the piston valves will occur. The next step is to secure the shock body by the lower mount in the vise. To help ease installation, apply a small amount of shock oil to the bottom O-ring of the bypass sleeve. Then, insert the bypass sleeve into the shock body by pressing it firmly down and seating it against the bottom of the shock. When inserting the bypass sleeve, make sure you have a snug fit and do not pinch or cut the O-ring. The next step is to replace the IFP O-ring and then insert the IFP into the bypass sleeve and set it to the proper depth. All PPS IFP depth specifications can be found in the Polaris service manuals. With the IFP in place, install the Schrader valve core at the Schrader valve. Then, slowly fill the shock with Polaris oil, part number 2873716. Oil will fill the shock between the outer body and the bypass sleeve. Fill the shock to within 1 inch, or 2.54 centimeters, of the outer shock body, which is just below the threads. With the bleed screw removed, apply a small amount of oil onto the piston band. Then, with the cylinder head assembly pushed down against the piston, carefully insert the shock rod into the shock cylinder. You may need to slightly oscillate the piston rod to allow the piston to enter the shock body correctly. During installation, some shock oil will overflow. Wrap a shop cloth around the body to catch possible oil overflow. Now, thread the bearing all the way in. Oil will spill over the sides until the O-ring makes a seal. Once the seal is made, oil will continue to come out of the bleed screw orifice. When the bearing cap has been fully threaded into the shock body, torque the bearing cap to 55 foot-pounds, or 76 newton-meters. Then, install the bearing cap bleed screw and O-ring. You can then gas charge the shock through the Schrader valve. Charge the shock to the specified pressure listed in the Polaris manuals. The shock rod should fully extend when it is charged. You should then cycle the shock rod up and down a few times. As you push the rod down, feel for any dead spots. Also, watch the rod as it extends. If any quick movement occurs, you still have air in the shock, and it will need to be bled out. Please refer to the shock rod installation section of this video. The function of the PPS shock is to give the rider a plush ride in the ride zone. As you cycle the shock, you will feel a slight, quick adjustment of shaft speed in the middle of the stroke. This is a normal reaction for this shock. You are now ready to reinstall the sleeves and bushings in the lower shock mounts and reinstall the shocks on the vehicle. Before beginning disassembly of the Fox shock with removable bearing caps, first remove the shock from the vehicle. If the shock incorporates a spring, remove the spring and collateral retainers. Remove the upper and lower sleeve and bushings from the shock mount eyelets, and wash and dry the shock body. It is important that the gas shock be retained in the vise by the lower mount, or with the shock body clamp tool, part number 2871071. Any other method of securing the shock body during these procedures may deform the shock body cylinder. With the shock securely in the vise, remove the button head screw from the pressure valve. Then insert the tip of the Polaris shock pressurization-depressurization tool, part number 2200421, into the recess of the pressure valve. Depress the safety pin on the safety needle and push the gauge and needle assembly slowly toward the shock. This will insert the needle into the pressure valve. Be sure to push the needle completely into the shock valve. Make sure that the valve is pointed away from you and others, and then release the nitrogen in a safe direction by depressing the Schrader valve. Warning: nitrogen gas is under extreme pressure. Use caution when releasing nitrogen gas from the shock. Protective eyewear should be worn to avoid the risk of injury. After releasing the nitrogen gas, press down on the shock rod. If the shock rod moves upward, gas is still present, and the shock should be discharged again. Once the gas pressure is fully released, remove the pressure valve assembly and O-ring from the lower body cap. Then, with the shock shaft fully extended, use a 1-inch or 25 millimeter wrench to loosen the top bearing cap. If the sleeve of the shock starts to unscrew from the body, tighten it and try again. To keep the body from turning, it may be necessary to use the shock body clamp tool, part number 2871071. If you must use the shock body clamp tool, start by clamping the shock with the rod facing downward. Install the clamp at the small portion of the exposed end and tighten in the vise. Remove the lower body cap and inspect the O-rings and bearing cap for cracks or damage. Then set it aside for later use. Next, remove the IFP using the IFP installation tool, part number 2871351. To remove the IFP, you'll need to match up the flatlands on the IFP with the tool, and then turn the tool 180 degrees to secure the IFP. With the tool secured to the IFP, you can then pull the IFP out of the shock body. At this point, you'll need to be ready to catch the IFP wear band. Inspect the wear band and the O-ring on the IFP for damage and wear. Replace it if necessary. You should now pour out the old shock oil into an approved container. After the oil is poured out, remove the outside shock body sleeve and place it aside for later use. You should then clean the outside of the inner sleeve and place the clamp tool on the lower portion, just under the upper ring. With a 1-inch or 25 millimeter open-end wrench, you can then remove the cylinder head. If, while loosening the cap, the sleeve does not move, continue disassembly by pulling the shock rod straight out of the shock body. Be ready to catch the piston ring. Once the shock rod is removed, place it on a clean shop towel. You'll then need to pour the oil out of the shock body. Always discard old oil into an approved storage container and dispose appropriately. Never reuse shock oil during shock rebuilding. Next, clamp the shock body with the lower bearing cap facing upward using the shock body clamp tool. Then, remove the lower bearing cap and inspect the O-ring for damage. Replace the O-ring if necessary. The next step is to remove the IFP using the IFP installation tool, part number 2871351. With the tool secured to the IFP, you can then pull the IFP out of the shock body. At this point, you'll need to be ready to catch the IFP wear band. Inspect the wear band and the O-ring on the IFP for damage and wear, and replace if necessary. New piston rings are .050 inches or 1.3 millimeters thick and should be replaced if less than .047 inches or 1.2 millimeters. Remove the bleed screw from the IFP and inspect the O-ring. Replace it if necessary. Then, carefully clean and dry all parts thoroughly. The next step is to place the piston rod in a vise and begin the piston valve removal. On a clean shop towel, arrange all parts removed in the sequence of disassembly. At this time, you'll want to inspect the following items. The piston rod for straightness, nicks, burrs, or corrosion. The cylinder head assembly must be clean. It should be replaced if needed. Check the IFP Teflon piston wear band for cuts, chipped or nicked edges, or excessive wear. Check the O-rings for nicks, cuts, or cracks. Inspect the cap and rod seals for nicks, cuts, or cracks. And inspect the valve discs for kinks or waves. Should any of these items be in question, replacement is recommended. To assemble the shock, first place the piston rod upper mount into the vise. Then reassemble the valve piston assembly and valving in reverse order of disassembly. The first washer to be placed on the shock rod should be the bottom out washer. Then add the compression stack. Then add the piston with the greater amount of flats facing toward the lock nut end of the shaft. Then add the rebound stack and finish with the top-out washer. You will need to replace the lock nut with a new one, part number 7542411. Then torque the lock nut to 15 to 20 foot-pounds, or 21 to 28 Newton-meters. Next, inspect the valve piston ring for wear and replace it if needed. Compress the flexible piston ring around the valve piston, and then install the inner sleeve onto the piston rod. Screw in the inner sleeve by hand until the O-ring is fully seated. Then slide the shock body sleeve on until its O-ring is fully seated. The next step is to fill the shock with Polaris shock oil to the bottom of the threads of the shock body. This is approximately 1 inch, or 2.54 centimeters, from the end of the body. Be sure that the damper rod is fully extended. Slowly stroke the shock body up and down, immersing the damping piston in oil. Add more oil on top of the piston as required. Next, install the body cap until the O-ring is lightly seated. Allow the shock to stand for 3 to 5 minutes. This will remove all the air trapped inside the valve piston. After waiting 3 to 5 minutes, remove the body cap. Using a dial caliper, set the IFP tool to the correct depth by adjusting the lock colors. Place the IFP into the body of the shock, and then use the IFP tool to slowly push the IFP until the tool is against the shock body. With the IFP set, slowly stroke the shock rod to force any trapped air through the piston orifice. Move the shock rod slowly to prevent aeration of the oil, and allow all the air to purge through the IFP bleeder screw hole. With the air removed, install the bleeder screw into the IFP. Tighten the screw by holding the flats of the IFP or by using the IFP holding tool. Remove any excess oil from the top of the IFP area, and then verify the proper IFP depth to within 0.025 inches or 0.63 millimeters. Then reinstall the body cap with a new O-ring and tighten it by hand. You should then mount the shock at the body cap end and torque the bearing cap to 55 foot-pounds or 76 Newton-meters. The next step is to install the pressurizing valve with a new O-ring and tighten securely. Set the nitrogen tank pressure regulator to the specified PSI. Insert the safety needle, and then pressurize the shock to the specified PSI. Once pressurized, pull the needle straight out and remove it. The shock rod should extend fully when charged. Push the damper rod through a few full strokes to make sure that the shock is working properly. The damper must bottom out at full travel, then slowly rise to full extension. Shaft movement must be smooth and consistent throughout the entire compression and rebound stroke, without binding or loss of damping. The function of the PPS shock is to give the rider a plush ride in the ride zone. As you cycle the shock, you will feel a slight, quick adjustment of shaft speed in the middle of the stroke. This is a normal reaction for this shock. Once the shock is charged properly, reinstall the Allen screw into the pressure valve. You are then ready to install the springs, if it applies, and then install the shock on the vehicle. All special tools mentioned in this video can be ordered through the Polaris authorized tool vendor, SPX Kent Moore. You can order a copy of the Polaris Special Service Tool Catalog by calling SPX at 1-800-328-6657.